The 90s Clone Saga is potentially one of the most infamous comic book stories ever written, especially in the context of Spider-Man. However, it's also one of my favorite eras in comic books, in particular because it is the story that introduced the world to the Scarlet Spider, my favorite superhero. Now recently on the channel, I started a series called Clone Saga Quick Reviews, where essentially during my reread of the 90s Clone Saga, I'll tune into the channel and let you know what I thought of each story one by one. Now on the last video, we talked about the story called The Double Part 1 Born Again, where we saw the perspective of a Peter Parker clone being born and the tragedy of their life. That story ended with that clone escaping from Miles Warren's laboratory. But in today's Clone Saga Quick Review, we're going to be checking out the flipbook story from Amazing Spider-Man 394, The Double Part 2 No Escape.
Stars and Stripes!
Hello and welcome to another carrotscraps video, and by another I mean the 138th. And of course, before we get into the video, I wanted to give a couple of disclaimers up front. First of all, I wanted to give yet another content warning for the video. In this video, I briefly talk about the subject of suicide, how it relates to the story, and how it affects my life personally. So if that's something that makes you uncomfortable or you'd rather just not hear about, maybe it's better to skip this video for today. However, I try not to linger on the subject in the video, and I try to treat the topic with the respect and patience it deserves. Now, if you're curious about any of the stories that I'm reading and you want to follow along with the Clone Saga Quick Reviews, the method I suggested in the last video and the method that I suggest most frequently is checking out the Amazing Spider-Man Clone Saga Epic Collection, either on Comixology digitally or in physical trade paperback copies. However, there's also a Clone Saga Omnibus you can check out, but more importantly than any of that, there's also Marvel Unlimited. Marvel Unlimited is an incredible resource if you are trying to read comics on a budget, and though you might not have as good of a reading order as you would with the Epic collections, at least you'll be able to read all of these stories for a lot less money. So if you want to read along, make sure to check that out. Anyway, without further ado, let me talk about my feelings on The Double Part 2 No Escape. So, of course, before we get into my thoughts on the issue, we're going to talk a little bit about the comic itself. Today's story is the fantastic flipbook story from the back of Amazing Spider-Man 394, which came out in October of 1994. The story was written by JMD Mateus, the penciler is Liam Sharp, the inker is Robin Riggs, the colorist is John Callis, and Steve Dutro was the letterer. Now, like I mentioned in our last Clone Saga video, I'm going through my physical collection trying to locate all of the issues from the Clone Saga that I have. Typically when I reread the Clone Saga, it's using these digital books, which is what I'm still doing now, but it's been really nice going back and finding these original copies. And something funny about the issue that we're reading today is when I was going through my Amazing Spider-Man box, literally the first comic I pulled out was this issue. It was the issue that I needed, and I just thought that was a funny little coincidence. Now, as usual, one of the fun parts of checking out these older comics, not in reprinted format, but in their original form, is checking out the commercials and checking out the advertisements. And it seems as if Maximum Carnage was a huge plug at the time. You couldn't read Amazing Spider-Man or any Spider-Man comic without seeing a lot of Maximum Carnage ads. Now, something that I didn't mention in the last video, and that I'm not sure how to approach moving forward, is the letters pages. If you don't know, comic books often will have letters pages that print letters sent by fans, and often will have answers from the editors, or even the writers. It's a really cool way for Marvel to connect with their fan base. But the thing is, most of the time when these stories are reprinted, these letters pages are not. So another cool part of owning the original comic books is owning that piece of history. And so, I don't know, I just feel like while I have this comic book out, maybe I should read some of these letters. So moving forward, I thought I would toss it to you. What do you think? Should we read more of these letters pages? I think they're a really fun, interesting part of history, but I also want to focus on the stories and the Clone Saga itself. So I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Now, before we get into my thoughts, let's talk really quickly about what this story is about. The story we're talking about today once again follows the clone of Peter Parker who has escaped Miles Warren's lab. However, once he escapes, he realizes that he's not doing so well. Not only is he emotionally distraught, but he's physically fatigued, in addition to being shocked and horrified by his new powers. All of these events nearly cause him to die, and he almost embraces that fact. However, at the last moment, he decides to save himself to his own confusion. Eventually, Miles Warren appears dressed as the Jackal to collect his asset. After a battle ensues, Gwen Stacy dramatically appears. The clone is confused by this person before finally recognizing her. The memories of Peter Parker are slowly bubbling to the surface of this clone's mind, even if he still doesn't recognize what these memories mean. But in the end, Gwen's arrival was just another trap set by the Jackal, and Gwen turns out to be a clone who's just as confused as Ben is. And the issue ends with the Jackal disappearing into the night with his 2 clones. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's finally talk about my feelings on this story. So first things first is I absolutely love this cover on the flip book. I really think it's a cool cover, and I think that Marvel agrees with me because I believe this was used on the omnibus. So it definitely is a good representation of the Clone Saga in general, and I just think it's a cool piece of artwork, and it's one of those covers that I think of when I'm thinking about the Clone Saga, so I think they did a really good job here. Moving on, again, I really love the idea of Ben discovering his powers, and they explore it a lot more in this issue. It's definitely a bigger part of this story, where Ben is falling and, clutching onto walls and being confused by his abilities and being confused by his strength and especially his danger sense or his spider sense. All of that is a big part of this story, and I just think it's really interesting. Somebody who, I guess, is born and knows what it's like to be human somewhat, right? But is just completely upset and overwhelmed and somewhat dissociating because of how strange these powers are. And I just think it's a really cool idea, and it's one that isn't necessarily lingered on, but I think is really cool. Again, we're gonna talk about something a little bit serious, so I apologize for that, but I feel like there are themes of suicide in this story when it comes to Ben kind of embracing death and falling, to meet his demise. I can't help but notice that these stories and the way he's speaking feels a lot like the speech of somebody who is thinking about taking their own life, or at least accepting an early death. Again, not to get too personal, but I know what that's like. I know what it's like to want to do this. I've struggled with my mental health for many years, and I'm still on my mental health journey, and I've had many moments like this where I've struggled with suicide, and I just wanted to say, again, a quick, to anybody who might be struggling with the same, reach out to the ones that care about you, try to talk about it. Talking helps so much. And definitely make sure to get resources that are helpful to you, especially therapy. I think everyone can benefit from therapy, but especially individuals who are struggling with suicide. But to go back to the story a little bit, I feel like, again, this is what the story is dealing with and what it is talking about. And I think it comes from an interesting perspective. And as somebody who has struggled with this myself, it does feel refreshing to see a hero struggle with it as well, even if it's allegorical and even if it's metaphorical. So again, it's a brief part of the story, this kind of struggle with his whether he wants to live or die. But it's a really profound part of the story, and it's a part of the story that I really like. I also really like this voice inside him, talking about, there's some part of Ben that does want to live. The overwhelming ocean of who he is kind of fighting to extinguish himself, right? But this story focuses on another part inside of him who is trying to swim up from the depths and say, you know what? No, even if you are a monster, I don't know if you are, but even if you are a monster, you deserve to live. And even if you are confused with who you are, you deserve a chance at life. You don't need a reason to be alive. You can just be. I think the quote is, I just am. And I think that's a really powerful idea. I remember the first time I heard this idea of just, being alive is enough. You don't need to justify your existence. I think the first time I heard that, I literally cried because I might not have verbalized it, but I never really realized that I was being so hard on myself for just existing. And again, maybe not everybody can relate to that, but I've had a difficult life, and I have turbulent mental health, and so to see again a hero struggle with that, is really humanizing for me, and it's what makes this story, you know, so fascinating. And this story, I mean this one in particular, but also the Clone Saga in general, I think is really great. Moving on to something a little less great is the Jackal. I think, you know, again, I do like the Jackal, but I don't think he's the greatest villain, and I think the introduction of Jackal himself with his little one-liners and his super villainy, there's a lot here that brings down the issue in terms of quality. But first off, we get Poor Peter Parker, which is, of course, a quote from The Amazing Spider-Man 1. Even though this story was written first, we get a reference to that movie with the Poor Peter Parker, which I always love to see. The Jackal and his jetpack is very silly. I do think that the Jackal looks pretty well illustrated in this issue, but he does feel a little over the top, right, for the serious tone of the story, and he just feels a little too, like, again, a little too focused on one-liners for my liking. But again, that's part of the persona, that's part of who he is. Not the biggest fan of the way that Gwen is introduced in this issue. Both the way that she's used and the way that she's depicted, I don't know, I just don't like that she's kind of just this literal object, and obviously we'll have stories that flesh out the Gwen clone a little bit more, but, you know, she walks onto the scene. I'm not the biggest fan of the way that she was depicted in the issue, multiple times, right? And then she's just here to basically trick Ben into getting captured, right? Not the most interesting use of this character, in my opinion. But in the end, this is an important character. Both of these characters are, the Gwen clone and the Jackal, are important characters to the Clone Saga, and these are kind of big introductions for them chronologically to this story, right? I also really like Ben remembering being bit by the spider. I thought that was a really cool moment. Again, kind of allowing these waves of memories to come in, and for this, you know, new person to contextualize his life around memories that are arriving, you know, instincts that he has as a clone of Peter Parker, but as somebody who doesn't recognize those memories, he really is starting off new, and learning these memories is making him a different person. It's really interesting. I don't understand why. I mean, I guess I understand, but a lot of people really dislike clones and clone stories. Even recently, talking about Ben Reilly and the Scarlet Spider, I got a lot of pushback from someone online just talking about, like, oh, well, it's just a copy of Peter Parker, so why would I care? And I just don't know why people engage with this plot device in such a reductive way. I feel like obviously clones are used as a plot device to just get out of stories, right? Or to have an easy twist. There are plenty of bad clone stories, but I think if you take clones seriously and really explore them as a fun sci-fi idea, and then as a fun, you know, kind of conflict for a character emotionally, I feel like they could be really interesting and really fascinating. I think I've already explained why I think that is, but I don't know, it surprises me that people are so against clones in general, but in Spider-Man especially, both when I was reading these stories growing up, right? Like, I met a lot of comic book fans who hated the Clone Saga and were really rude to me when I would say this was, like, my favorite era in comic books. And then even now in 2023, I could post on Twitter about Ben Reilly and someone could be upset about it because isn't that just a copy of Peter Parker? Anyway, another moment in this story that I really love is Ben choosing to fight back. It felt very triumphant, even though eventually he kind of goes overboard and he starts talking about how this kind of violence is making him feel shameful and how it's a substitute for, you know, other emotions that he isn't able to express. I do like the initial fighting back and pulling himself up and saying, no, I need to defend myself. I deserve to live and all of that. I think that's pretty great stuff. And I really like all of these metaphors for the struggle of life and kind of fighting despair and shame throughout this story. Again, I think these are really interesting themes and really interesting ideas, probably for me specifically. I mean, again, I love the Clone Saga, and I've always said that I think the reason I love it so much is because when I started looking at Marvel characters, like, I had Clone Saga comic books in my household since I was a child, so I saw the Scarlet Spider early on, and then when I got into reading comics more seriously, because that image was, you know, burned into the back of my brain, I went looking for that character, and so basically that nostalgia, right, like, is what pulled me to the Clone Saga. But now I'm starting to realize that it's possible that played a part, but, you know, the fact that this story and these stories spoke to a part of me on a deeper level I feel like that's another reason why the Clone Saga is still so important to me and is one of the most important stories that I've read, is because it speaks to me in this way that other stories don't. And because it's kind of darker, it's exploring mental health to a degree, right? Maybe it's not doing it perfectly, but it's depicting a character having a struggle that isn't the same as mine, right? I'm not a clone, but he says and thinks a lot of the same things that I do. So I think this struggle of fighting despair and fighting shame is something that I've felt a lot just for existing, and seeing Ben struggle with that as a clone, is very meaningful to me. So that's been something very interesting about kind of rereading the Clone Saga right now. In general, also, moving on, clones live an awful life. It really sucks seeing the Jackal talk to Ben and Gwen and talk about them like they're just these objects, and it really sucks being a clone. You know what I mean? Obviously, I feel like that's an obvious statement, but like, man, the Jackal sucks. Super rude, mean, awful things to do. I hate that guy. And then also I wanted to talk about hypnosis. It was only barely mentioned in this issue, but in the previous issue, hypnosis was talked about a little bit. And hypnosis is another silly thing, like I feel like most people laugh at, like it's a plot device, it's a contrivance, and so it's overused. And I feel like I'm less defensive over hypnosis, but the way that it's implemented in these two stories, where people are basically being brainwashed into being someone they're not or doing something they don't want to do, that's horrifying. It's terrifying. And so as a plot element that's taken seriously, even though on the face of it sounds silly, being oh no, they're using hypnosis, like it's a really scary thing, and so I just think it's a frightening part of this story. And the last thing I wanted to mention about the issue is that I'm not the biggest fan of the artwork. There are some panels that I like, there's some art that I like I mentioned, I like the way the Jackal looks, but overall I'm not the biggest fan of the artwork in this issue. I always think about the way that Gwen looks in her big kind of splash page appearances when I think of bad art in the 90s Clone Saga. It's not the worst art in the 90s Clone Saga, but for some reason, just her outfit, which, points for not putting her in her, last appearance outfit, right? But I just am not a fan of the outfit that she was put in, and I just don't like the way that she was illustrated. And so this art literally comes to mind all the time when I think of bad art in the Clone Saga, even if that's not necessarily fair. But again, that being said, the rest of the art isn't the worst in the world, and there's a lot that I do like about it. I lied, that was the last thing. One other thing I wanted to mention is that on the cover of the comic, it says Birth of a Spider-Man, which is a great title, right? It's Birth of a Spider-Man, not Birth of the Spider-Man, because it's about Ben Reilly and his story. But then when you get into the story is called The Double. And I don't know, I just think that's interesting that the cover has a different title than the book has. So in the end, this is another chapter in the story that I quite like. Again, I like it for some reasons that I didn't think I would. It's a lot deeper than I gave it credit for, even if I recognized these themes in past readings. Actually sitting down and trying to be critical and trying to look at all of the aspects of the story, I'm realizing just how much I connect with this on a deeper level. So I do really love this story, and I liked this chapter in it. I'm not the biggest fan of the artwork, and I do think that there are some weird tonal moments, but overall I think it's a good story. So I'm going to give it an interesting out of words. I give this story an interesting, and that is my review scale. On the next episode of Clone Saga Quick Reviews, we'll be reading the flipbook story from Adjectiveless Spider-Man number 51, also known as The Double Part 3, Who Am I? Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. If for some reason you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and to subscribe to my channel for more. As regular viewers know, I make a variety of content on my channel, and I'm always going to make the videos that I want to make. But if you see something you enjoy, make sure to let me know, and I'll try to prioritize that kind of content in the future. Over on Twitch, I typically play superhero games like Marvel's Avengers, Marvel's Snap, and the occasional horror game like Resident Evil. So if that sounds interesting to you at all, check me out on Twitch at twitch.tv/carrotscraps. And all my other social media, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram are at carrotscraps as well. So I want to thank you again so much for watching, and I'll see you soon. It's Spider-Man. Come on, grab your friends. We'll go to the 90s with Ben the clone and Peter the human. The tragedy will never end. It's the Clone Saga. Oh boy. It's fun. It's fun. Beyond the tragedy, it's fun. It's still fun sometimes.